Let's just start with a little bit of a background, sort of 2-minute, who are you, what do you do?
Hi everyone, I'm Bethel, and it's great to be here with you all today. So very quickly, my background, I was raised Christian, became Christian when I was 4, so yeah, I was that kid. Both of my parents are academics, and they're very involved in Christian apologetics scene, but it's complicated, so we'll probably get into that later. So what I do now is I'm a freelance writer, a cultural critic. I'm somehow able to make a living doing this stuff, which we'll see how much longer that goes on. I thought for a while, I did a PhD in mathematics, and I thought I was going to be in academia and be a teacher, and I taught high school for a little bit, but now I'm just kind of riding the wave and see where that takes me. So I wouldn't call myself an apologist proper. I'm not really in the industrial complex, so to speak, and I have lots of complicated thoughts about that. But I do love apologetics and know a lot about it, and so I'm looking forward to contributing here.
You've already heard me blab about my autobiographic details. As it relates to this conversation, I think a couple of points of clarification or extra tidbits. So after high school, I spent 3 years at a Pentecostal pseudo-seminary called Fire School of Ministry, studying underneath Dr. Michael Brown, who's was a famous, he was the predominant apologist arguing why Jesus is the Messiah, so he had primarily a Jewish audience. Then after that, I went to Wheaton College, where Dr. Bart Ehrman and Dr. William Lane Craig have studied, and got a degree in Christian heavy metal there. So I'm a former apologetics debate lover, James White and Dr. Michael Brown and all those guys. So.
Hi, everyone, again. As it relates to this, I spend a lot of my time online now engaging with those who engage in apologetics for the Mormon faith, its defenders and its strong advocates. In my own personal life, before everything fell apart, as we've discussed already, I engaged in apologetics myself. I was a strong defender of the faith. I was a Mormon missionary. I went, knocked on doors, wore the little badge, the whole 9 yards, and have engaged a lot in these kinds of conversations. And more specifically was given official church positions to advocate locally for the church. So I said I had a lot of thoughts about apologetics. I do. I'm also aware that just like with the rest of Christianity, Mormonism does things its own special little way. So I'm also excited to learn about what the broader Christian apologetics scene looks like and be involved in that discussion too.
I'm Nathan Jacobs. Let's see, I am an artist turned scholar turned filmmaker, and I say that because that's kind of a biographical sketch, more so than it is a professional one. So I'm somebody who started out in the fine arts world as a fine arts painter, drawer. I went to art school at the Maryland Institute College of Art in Baltimore. And I was hurled into the study of philosophy and religion because of a bad acid trip, which I'm happy to talk about sometime. But that's what caused me to, in my 3rd year of art school, leave in order to start studying philosophy and church history and historical theology and get a host of degrees. And that was really just me pursuing questions. I had no academic aspirations. This was just somebody who had become obsessive about these big ultimate and penultimate questions and wanted answers, so I followed them wherever they went. And that eventually, after finishing that academic journey, I became a professor of philosophy and religion. Published in the area of philosophy and religion, but the journey where it ultimately led me was eventually it led me into Eastern Orthodoxy. So I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian, a late in life convert to that. And so happy to talk about that. What I do now is after being a professor of philosophy and religion for a while on the side, I was working on film. I paid my way through grad school working in the video game industry as a concept artist and storyboard artist, which is its own story. Met a bunch of filmmakers along the way who kept on teasing me that I should try my hand at film, and I eventually did that while I was a college professor, bootstrapped an independent feature film, which led to another film. and then being asked to step out of academia on this crazy thing of being a writer and a director, which I did. The biggest thing I've worked on since then was the big Amazon show, House of David. If you've heard of that, I was a writer and producer on that. If you don't like it, I'm not offended. But because at heart, I don't label myself an apologist. But there is a sense in which, as somebody who has come to these things really just through the personal journey of wanting to understand and spent years and years and years in crisis of wrestling with big questions and exploring all sorts of different roads, I'm always very sympathetic to, well, really anyone I meet, wherever they're at on their spiritual journey. And so oftentimes I will simply speak to people on a personal level about where are you at and what are the things that you're struggling with. And whenever I talk about the history of ideas, I tend to talk descriptively. I don't tend to talk prescriptively about this is why you should believe Jesus rose from the dead, right? Something like that. Instead, I tend to talk about the history of ideas and tackle questions just from, well, this is what Aquinas might say, or this is what John of Damascus might say, or something like that. And that's partially because I'm actually a believer that truth tends to make itself known. I don't need to advocate for it in order for that to happen. And so that's where I suppose at the end of the day, what I tend to do is I tend to be a teacher, which I guess has a certain apologetic result to it, I think, sometimes. But in terms of professionally, what I do is I work in film and television as a writer and director while also doing a podcast and a Substack and things like that. Still publishing books and articles and things like that, but no longer teaching. So there you go. I think that was more than 2 minutes, but here you go. Yeah, well.
I want to be this guy when I grow up.
Harsh.
Well, great. So I want to spend the time today to kind of talk about apologetics and some of the assumptions that the industry has about how we form worldviews and how that plays out in reality. But before we do that, let's just talk a little bit about your exposure to apologetics. And Bethel, I want to start with you. Mm-hmm. Apologetics is sort of the family business. What was it like being raised by apologists?
Wow, yeah, it was different, for sure. I think what I admire about my parents is they really paid their dues in academia proper before coming to apologetics. They were philosophers first and foremost, and so that's where they, did their degrees, published their papers, got their hard knocks. So, when they came to apologetics sort of later in both of their academic careers, they really brought a lot of rigor and academic integrity. And so that was just really kind of the byword of my household is, we're really going to think seriously about why we believe what we believe. We're going to follow the evidence where it leads. I think evidentialism, a lot of people have some sort of straw men and misconceptions about what evidentialism means. It doesn't mean that only smart people can have good reasons to believe in God. It doesn't mean that emotion is for stupid people, so a lot of kind of surface level right brain, left brain commentary there. And I think another thing my parents were very good at was connecting prose with passion, because they were both also very literary. They kind of fell in love initially over literature. And so I was also taught great poetry, great films. Nathan talks about films. I'm also a film lover, film critic. And so they really did a great job connecting up all of those things. And C.S. Lewis, obviously, sort of my hero in that regard. And my Substack, I have business cards I've been handing out, and there's a lamppost on there. It's called Further Up. So yeah, I might be a slight fan of Lewis, and I think he kind of is like goals, kind of epitomizes that. So there's a lot more that I could say, and maybe get into that more later. And, some of the sadness and the difficulty and the schisming that we've experienced and disillusionment with the apologetics industrial complex came from realizing that not everybody shared my parents' same commitment to academic accountability and academic integrity, and that was just a long, slow, painful realization process. I mean, not quite like, I don't want to like compare to this like Nemo's story, but I mean, when he was talking about sort of wanting to tell people that they had been lied to and that sort of thing, you know, on a smaller, less traumatic scale, my family have been sort of in the business of going around trying to tell people that certain apologists have lied to them. And that's not fun, and it hasn't made them any friends, and it's made them some enemies. But anyway, more on that later.
I would love to hear
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
I have kind of a complicated relationship with apologetics because I think that most of my atheist friends just see it as an exercise in confirmation bias, and they think the whole enterprise should be torn down. I kind of make a concession where I sort of see apologetics as a natural outgrowth of belief, right? Because if you entirely strip away apologetics, then it seems like you're saying, hey, you have to be a fideist. You have to, just take a leap of faith. So I'm willing to kind of play nice and, give my Christian friends a pass in doing some form of apologetics. But I still agree that I think at the end of the day, I struggle to see how it is anything other than starting with a conclusion and looking for reasons to validate that conclusion. Jonathan Haidt talks about this in The Righteous Mind, that we are emotional creatures looking for rational reasons to validate what we want to believe. And to me, I think that apologetics, whether that's defending the historicity of the resurrection, or whether it's narrative and psychological apologetics, I think that almost always it starts with the presupposition and then is looking for evidence for it. I realize now this might be the most like an atheist I sound when talking about apologetics, but yeah, so.
We're just moving along, are we? Okay.
Nemo, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background?
About my background with apologetics and things like that. Okay. So Mormonism's relationship to apologetics is quite interesting, I find, because it is a church that claims to have a man who speaks for God at its head. So really, what function could apologetics play? If you need answers about why this is that way or why things are happening the way they're happening, just go ask the man who claims he can speak for God, not to God, for him, like on his behalf, as a direct representative of deity. That's a pretty bold card to play when you're trying to say this is the way things should be, and yet there are entire institutions dedicated to apologetics for Mormonism. And I used to engage with those. I used to support those. I used to repeat their lines. I used to go out and speak. When you're a Mormon missionary, you encounter the street preacher and you go, right, okay, I can do this. You have this moment of, I can Bible bash with the rest of them. You're told not to. You're just explicitly told not to. And I think it's because leaders of the church realize how biblically illiterate Mormons are, by and large. And you discover that for yourself very quickly as a young Mormon missionary at the age of 19 on the street. Like, I don't know half of this. I know the Book of Mormon really well, but the Bible, not a lot. I've got some cherry-picked verses I can fall back on, but when the conversation gets deeper, that becomes troubling. And so what I chose to do, rather than at the time question why my church had not better prepared me for the broader canon of our scripture, I thought, well, I'm going to then go on this journey myself of learning more about this, of learning how Mormonism engages with the Bible, how I can better defend my faith against, as I viewed it then, other interpretations of the Bible that disconfirm my beliefs. So that was my relation to it when I was pro-apologetics. Now, my relationship to it is very much, I find apologetics deeply frustrating, and I am often engaged in picking apart apologetic arguments for Mormonism online, and in part all underpinned by the why are you even speaking to this topic? You have a man who claims to speak for God, go ask him. Which, is complicated in its own sense, I guess.
So my background with apologetics, I had, I'll go back to childhood. I grew up in Chicago. My mother was a Lutheran. She was She genuinely had an authentic faith, but she went through a crisis of belief at some point before I came along. And for that reason, began to read a lot of different apologists. So a lot of the names you might name, like William Lane Craig or whoever it might be, Ravi Zacharias, Hugh Ross, etc. I had already heard those names. And because of my mom, my siblings who were older than me, I was a late unexpected gift, hence my name, although they weren't sure who I was a gift from, which is why the L is omitted. We don't want to be presumptuous that I'm a gift from God. But nonetheless, my family had been exposed to apologetics really through my mom. Now, my dad was not anything as far as I could tell. And so there was this interesting dynamic within our family because on the one hand, he was supportive, sure, go ahead, take them to church, sure, go ahead and send them to a Lutheran grade school, whatever it might be. But he wasn't hesitant to speak very skeptically about the very beliefs that my mom espoused. And, being descended from Chicago construction workers, they can be rather blunt in terms of what they think about things. So I grew up around argument, pounding on tables, smoke-filled, because we would smoke in our homes back then, but smoke-filled kitchens while we discussed things. And I loved it. Right, that was stimulating to me as a child, and for that reason, I never had, Jared, you talked about, this sense that you would hear from people about religion being shoved down your throat, and that wasn't your experience. I would oftentimes hear people say, well, questions weren't welcome, and I was like, really, that was not my experience at all. That's all people cared about was debating questions. That's what I grew up around. And I found it very stimulating. And I think it's one of the reasons why it was instilled in me that to ask hard questions and wrestle with hard questions and pursue answers was actually a good thing. And so that's what I grew up around. And so even though I wandered away from faith when, as soon as it was in my hands to do so, I never wandered away with a sense that Christianity was dumb or unreasonable or something like that. I thought, no, there's plenty of reasonable arguments in defense of it. I just didn't think it had any relevance to my life. And then once I went into my entire crisis on my own and began to study the history of ideas, I actually had a bit of an allergy to apologetics. So in academia, where I started to pursue philosophy or historical theology or whatever it might be, there was always this sense, a cultural sense within the academy of, well, apologists are over here. They have an axe to grind, they have an agenda. Their goal is to convince you of this, right? They're debaters, whatever it might be. Whereas philosophy was this other thing of exploring ideas. And because I wanted an honest engagement, I tended to distance myself from apologists because I saw them as in some ways dishonest. Now, I think that's uncharitable, but at the time, that was, well, it may be. We'll see. But at the time, I just sort of distinguished those two things culturally within the academy. And as somebody who was looking for answers, I tended to surround myself more with philosophers. If I was talking about Bible or church history, I tended to gravitate toward more liberal Bible scholars or church historians, really just because I thought, okay, I'm looking for the people who will give me the honest stuff, right? And so going through that, I never thought of myself as an apologist. This is one of the reasons why. I'm sure there are some people who probably think of me as an apologist, which is kind of funny to me because, I guess we would have to define the term. But at the end of the day, what I tend to do is I tend to just deal in the history of ideas, and I try to do so honestly. So, my first book was on Immanuel Kant, and it was in defense of Kant's religion, where I looked at Kant's philosophy of religion text, and I argued for its coherence. And as a result, a lot of people thought of me as two things, a Kant scholar and as a Kantian. And I am not. There are a few people in the world who I think are more wrong than Immanuel Kant, but I just wanted to understand him, and my sole goal was to read this text in a coherent fashion. My most recent book was on Leibniz. I'm defending the coherence of his views in terms of his optimism. I'm not a Leibnizian. And so I've always had this tendency to just try to read and understand people and their systems of thought in the most charitable and accurate way. Jared, you talked about wanting to be able to say back to a person, this is what you think, right? This is what you believe. And them saying, yes, that's accurate. And so my exploration of the history of ideas was always aimed at that just sort of honest engagement. And for that reason, whenever I engage the history of ideas, I tend to do so in a narrative form that is really more descriptive, having to do with the conclusions I've come to as somebody who's walked through this. And like I said, I think that ends up having a certain apologetic result to it, which leads some people to think of me as apologist, but I've never thought of myself because I've always sort of distinguished what Bethel might call the apologetic industrial complex from, the world of philosophy proper, which is the world that I came out of. So.
Great. So let's start this conversation broad. What assumptions do you think the apologetics world has in how we form what we believe and answer big questions of meaning? And where, in your experiences, has that sort of differed, or how does it live up to the experience that you have in your lived context of people actually asking big questions, trying to figure out what they believe?
Yeah, big question for sure. I think, Jared's already brought up Jonathan Haidt and, the Rider and the Elephant. And there's a sense in which I would agree with him and a sense in which I would depart. So the sense in which I think this is accurate and this is something that just life experience teaches you is that people are just, often they're not even going to be interested in the arguments. There's a lot of apathyism, I think, out there. People who, they're not even hostile to Christianity necessarily, but they just kind of, it's not really relevant to me, and I'm just going to kind of go on my way. And I think that can be a blind spot with, good and bad apologists alike. This is not necessarily like a knock on apologists, but I think there can be a sort of a naivete, and that can be kind of passed on to younger apologists. Like, if you just go out there and you say the right words and you hand them the right book, it's like magic, It's just like it's all gonna work out. And life just doesn't work that way. People don't work that way. And so, in that sense, yeah, the elephant, the rider and the elephant very often is in charge. A lot of times there's emotional things in the mix, political things in the mix, personal stuff, all kinds of, barriers. However, I do think man still is the rational animal. And I think that is meaningful still. So just because very often the elephant does run the show doesn't mean the elephant has to run the show. And that was something that was instilled in me by my parents. So I would say it's good to not be naive about these things, and it's good to tell the next generation of up-and-coming apologists to really, just manage your expectations. Like, just don't get your hopes up, because then they're just going to be crushed, But at the same time, I think there are reasons to believe, and it's good to discuss those. It's important to discuss those, and I wouldn't agree with what Jared said, that it's just beginning with a conclusion and working your way back. I think you can sort of come at this from the bottom up. But yeah, I do concede that it can get quite complicated when you're dealing with real people in the real world.
Nathan, you had mentioned, there are some very good arguments for the existence of God. And I think to that, I would probably say, hell yeah, amen. I think there are some. And I think that there may be some good arguments for, certain Christian creeds or stances. But to me, the entire enterprise of apologetics feels like, hey, we can not just acknowledge that there are some good arguments, we're only going to take those arguments, and any arguments that, point to the other conclusions, we're going to table those, we're going to shelve those. And so I think, Bethel, when I'm hearing you, say, that this can be done from the ground up, I think for me it feels like, well, that's just theology at that point. that's just philosophy or theology, looking at all of the arguments, whether they support our conclusions or reject our conclusions, or are pre-existing ideas about a matter. And so, but I think, Bethel, I'm curious, like, what does apologetics look like done well? And then what is the difference between that and the apologetics industrial complex?
Well, great. This is going to turn into like a dialogue here. Can we just
Yeah, go
can I
for it.
answer that? Yeah. So I think apologetics it's a terrible formula, but it's an excellent habit. And so I think apologetics is at its worst when it's turned into a formula. And it's at its best when it's more like a practice or a discipline or a habit. And I mean, discipline has a double meaning. It can mean in terms of an academic discipline, or it can mean like a personal discipline. And so I think the worst failures of apologetics, I'm thinking of things like, minimal fats, like here's 5 things that all the smart scholars agree about, and you can just kind of hand these to people in a neat little package, and if you check all the boxes, perfect, then Jesus rose from the dead, and of course, if Jesus rose from the dead, then Christianity is true. Don't get me started on that, it's just so... And then, you get them in there, and, always be closing, like the Glengarry Glen Ross thing, right? Get them in there, get them to say Jesus rose from the dead, and then they're Christians, hallelujah, let's go have dinner, I hate that. It's terrible. And then, you actually look into the stuff behind that, and it's so sloppy, and the books are they're terrible. And anyway, I could go on for a long time. So I think apologetics done well is actually, really truly wanting to follow the evidence where it leads. And, sometimes that might take you in a more conservative direction. And I do think there can be there can be a tendency to think that more liberal corresponds with more integrity, because then you really know they're not biased, right? Because then if they're following a direction that leads them away from a more conservative conclusion, then that must really kind of be where the evidence lies. And I just really don't think that that's true. And when I look at my mother's scholarship, because she's a New Testament scholarship, and New Testament scholar, she's done lots of scholarship. She has a bunch of books. A lot of the methodology, the techniques that she uses to scrutinize Scripture are things that she would apply to other texts as well, other contexts. Thinking about, okay, does this feel like witness testimony? What are the characteristics of believable witness testimony? You can apply that in all kinds of contexts, oral history, criminal cases. I kind of have a fascination with that kind of stuff. I mean, just recently I went down this rabbit trail on the Michael Jackson story and all that kind of stuff. And, I was listening to, these guys who claimed that they were abused and thinking, do I believe them? Do I not? What would be were the markers of their credibility? And in a way, it didn't feel that much different from when I read the Gospels and I think, well, do I believe this? Do I not? And so it's not necessarily just bound to the frame of Christianity. It's just, what's good practice? What's good historical practice? So that'd be the beginning of an answer.
That's totally fair. But I think we might just be operating on different definitions then.
Okay.
Because I think that, to me, all of that is just good scholarship and good history. To me, apologetics would be saying Michael Jackson is innocent, and here are the 18 reasons why, versus the 28 reasons why he's not. And to me, I'm looking at, there are thousands of seminaries in America where you cannot be a teacher there unless you affirm and sign a statement of faith. You are explicitly saying, I cannot follow the research where the research goes if it questions these fundamental tenets of the faith. And to me, that makes me uncomfortable. It's like, there's no other science, there's no other field of research where that's game. Even something like, if I were to say, evolution is ahistorical, right? If a bona fide researcher and scholar made a discovery like that, everyone would be so stoked. It would be like, can you imagine like how upending that would be in the scientific community. I mean, it would be revolutionary. And if it would be sufficiently sourced with data and research and scholarship, then, I think it would be warmly accepted.
Can I just, Sarah, now pass the microphone down. I'm going to say something a little provocative. So since Michael Jackson has come up, I actually found myself, as I was kind of engaging with the fans and all that sort of stuff, the people who say Michael Jackson is innocent sound kind of like Bart Ehrman. But I'll just kind of let that sit. Anyway.
I'm meant to follow that somehow, am I? Okay, all right. Yeah, no. So with my own encounter with apologetics, I think a few of the flaws and drawbacks I see are, so I think about Kerry Muhlestein, professor of Egyptology at BYU, because the Book of Mormon engages with ancient Egypt in ways that we won't go into now. But some of Mormon scripture is underpinned by claims about ancient Egypt. And so he said, with no hint of irony, and with no seeming self-awareness of what this means, said, I start with the conclusion that the Book of Mormon is true. And all the information I get, I try to fit into that paradigm. That is motivated reasoning. That is confirmation bias, whatever we want to call it. And so I think, for me, that's a very clear example of what Jared's talking about. Like, those people exist. And that's bad apologetics, because it's just so clear what the motivation is. Right. But I think when it is good, when it can be good, and what it's missing often is this idea of it being a discussion, a conversation. It's a conversation with the evidence, with the facts, with the things that you're engaging. It's a conversation with the scriptures, and it's a conversation with the people that you're trying to talk to. That would seem to me to be what good apologetics would look like. Apologetics being, sort of, to my view, any conversation that's being had because someone has turned up with a concern or a doubt. Because that, in all the ways in which I've engaged with apologetics, it always seems to be sort of focused around this idea of there's a problem here to be overcome. And then the flaw becomes, do the apologists adequately understand the nature of the problem? Do they adequately understand why someone is wrestling with this particular part of Scripture, why they're struggling with this particular part of their faith? Do they really understand why? Or are they just saying, well, if I can give them enough facts, if I can give them enough logic, or if I can give them enough reasons that I don't think it's a problem, maybe then they won't. Again, within Mormonism, there is a quote from a senior church leader who said, it is more important that we provide an answer than that it's a good one. Sometimes when you're just trying to defend a position, for some people it's just enough to know that a smart man over there says that there's a reason I can believe, so I can then believe. And it allows you to just do a big shortcut in your brain and go, don't need to worry about it. But then when you actually start to engage, you see that the argument quickly falls apart. So those are just some of my quick thoughts there.
So there's a lot of different things swirling around in my mind because of all the different things we've touched on. I'll say a couple of different things. Jared, you talked about good scholarship, and I agree. That in some ways, one of the ways in which I would describe what I do now in the history of ideas, is that if I became an atheist tomorrow, I wouldn't renounce any of my publications, because they are all descriptive. This is something that would happen all the time in class, where I teach the history of ideas. And at some point halfway through the semester, somebody would suddenly realize, Dr. Jacobs, you haven't told us what you think about anything. And I said, oh, yeah. Well, what do you care what I think, right? And it was always, that's always been my goal, right? That when I'm talking about these history of ideas, even if I'm doing something like, here's how the Cappadocians could respond to Immanuel Kant on the problem of divine revelation, there may be something apologetic in the sense that it's showing that there is a response to Kant's objection, but nowhere in the article do I say the Cappadocians are right. I'm just saying, here's how they could respond. And that's one of the reasons why, if I suddenly became an atheist and I no longer believed what the Cappadocians believed, it wouldn't change anything about that article for me. It would still be descriptively true. And so that's a big part of what I do, which I think is slightly different than what you're describing, right? So when you're talking about these sort of these bias-driven, I'm starting with my conclusion and driving forward, I think you're right. Those people do exist. That's definitely a thing that is out there. And I don't think, and I'll say, being inside academia, I don't agree that all scholars would be thrilled with certain upending conclusions. Because actually my experience has been the opposite, that oftentimes scholars, especially specialists, their entire life is staked on being right about this one thing. And therefore, I cannot be wrong. On an existential level, I cannot be wrong. And I've seen that in Kant studies, right? My reading of Kant was novel and so on. And this is one of the reasons why one of the markers of people who I think are most intellectually honest are the people who are willing to say I was wrong. So I'll give you an example. Nicholas Walterstorff, a philosopher, used to be at Calvin, went to Yale, a philosopher of religion. I'll tell you the thing that gives me, that Nick published, that gives me the utmost respect for him. It's none of the books on epistemology or divine discourse or whatever. It's the fact that in the foreword to my book, after he read my book on Kant, he said, "You've definitively proved me wrong. And this is the best reading we have." Scholars don't do that. But the fact that Nick is willing to do that, I thought, wow, okay, that's very impressive. You're intellectually honest. And I think that might be one of the key markers of the difference between, good and bad apologetics. It's just intellectual honesty. Now, I think this does go, of course, Jared, to the other point that you're raising about confirmation bias. And I think this is going into an area of anthropology. Obviously Bethel raised, we are rational animals. And so she's acknowledging, of course, that we do have certain biases. We are social animals who are influenced by what everybody knows who are around us and so on. And we can look at, sociologists like Peter Berger about, the sort of cognitive dissonance that sets in if you believe that you're part of a cognitive minority. And obviously you mentioned Jonathan Haidt as well. And so we can talk about those things, but it does go to this question of anthropology of saying, but is that determinative for beliefs full stop? Now, I'm of the mind that it's not. And so I think it's very powerful, but this is one of the reasons why in my own journey, I made a point to entertain the most horrifying things possible. Like, no, seriously. I mean, when I was in crisis, I was like, okay, I'm going to entertain that God doesn't exist. I'm going to entertain that if he does exist, he's a moral monster. Right, and I'm going to entertain that I don't have free will, all of these sorts of things, because I thought that was just an important part of intellectual honesty. And so I suppose in some ways my view on this would be similar to ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, where you're acknowledging and recognizing certain, impulses, certain, dispositional tendencies, addictions, whatever they might be. But you're also recognizing that there's a part of you that is capable of dissociating and not treating those as mandates and assessing and habitually, making an assessment that moves in a different sort of direction. So I do believe in free will, and this is, I think, where what we're running into is an underlying question of free will and whether or not things like what the ancients would call the passions or, whatever we want to label them are ultimately determinative for what we believe, which I don't. But I do think they are powerful, and I think it's very important for us to be attentive to those if we're going to be intellectually honest. I think that's absolutely essential. So
you guys have all touched on this a little bit, of this idea of when we're coming to the questions of apologetics, it's often on the things we hold most sacred, the things we care about the most, and the things that we want to spread out the world and defend. How do we fight with ourselves in this process of apologetics to, wrestle with the sense of, and Jared, you said this in our conversation before, this prerogative to preach. And that's particularly, I think, true with sort of religious apologetics, but it happens in non-religious apologetics as well. So what are your thoughts on that? How do we wrestle with that, just as, well, a lot of us are viewers, but in the world of that, of creators and viewers of apologetics?
If I may. I think one of my big looming questions is what is the purpose of apologetics? And I know that you don't consider yourself an apologetic. You dubiously do?
Kind of, sort of.
Kind of, sort of? Okay. So, apologetics normally has a few different explicit goals, right? One of them is evangelistic, right? To convince other people of the truth claims of the gospel or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But then, in addition to that, I think it also has some level of comfort, right? To, to tell people who are confident of this gospel, hey, you can be even more confident in it. There's an underlying rationality to this whole venture. So fair enough. What do we make of, the people who don't believe, in spite of apologetics? What are we to make of this? Are they ignorant? Are they foolish? Are they willfully blinded? There's a real question there of what do we say to the people who just say this is not persuasive? So there's that. And then in addition to that, I think I'm wondering, from an ex-Christian perspective, does apologetics make Christians better? Because if we can say kind of concretely that it's not very effective in evangelism, well, that's one of the two reasons why we do it to begin with. So then, is it making Christians better? And I think one of my looming questions is just Christianity is such a unique religion because it's all about orthodoxy, right? It's about right belief rather than orthopraxy, right practice. And I think that's always made me a little uncomfortable because there's no other domain of my life where my ideas are judged above my actions. And I think it's so strange. Now, I know that Orthodox soteriology, the study of salvation, is different than Protestant soteriology. But it's always been really curious to me that whether or not you get into heaven or not into heaven is contingent on ideas, what you think. Doesn't matter how many times how much time you've spent in an orphanage. It's, do you accept certain faith propositions? Do you accept the Nicene Creed, right? And to me, that's just always felt so bizarre. And so, apologetics is really primarily a Christian phenomenon. I'm sure that some of the other Abrahamic faiths play that game as well, but I think it's predominantly Christian. And I don't know what to make of that.
Can I jump in? So I do think, Jared, when you describe that, you're describing from your Protestant experience. So being an Eastern Orthodox guy, I'll go ahead and point out a few differences. No. I think these are. I think what you're pointing out is really important because I think an Eastern Orthodox Christian might level some of the same critiques. So the terms dogma and kerygma, right? What is oftentimes teaching and preaching is how it's translated. In Basil of Caesarea, that's not what those terms mean. Dogma actually refers to the lived faith of the church. And then kerygma is when you have to talk about it because there's emerged some sort of opponent. And so what's interesting is in somebody like Basil, when talking about Orthodox dogma, it was the liturgy. It's fasting, it's praying. It was the entire practice of asceticism and lived faith. And in fact, somebody like Chrysostom, this is, when talking about the life of a philosopher, this was one of the points I was making last night when I was talking about how you define that philosophy and theology were not always separated in the ancient world the way they are today. Chrysostom talks about Basil living the life of a philosopher, by which he meant he became a monk. And that's, again, because Socrates defines the philosopher as one who loves wisdom. Wise you may not call them, for that name belongs to one, which is God. They are lovers of wisdom. And the lovers of wisdom was not necessarily an idea, a set of ideas, as it was a lived pursuit of a life of wisdom, a certain good life. And so I think in terms of the movement toward this idea that it's primarily about what you believe, is actually it's an artifact of a certain type of Protestant way of thinking that would be actually critiqued as a form of Gnosticism by a lot within the Christian East. And in fact, you have a whole host of stories that are rather interesting that actually go against this. So I'll give you the story of, this is one of, there's a story of a man who was converted to Arianism. So this is during the Arian dispute. And he was in a place where there was not a church where he could go to the divine liturgy. He was taught one prayer by some Aryan wandering, preacher. And he prayed that fervently every day and committed himself so fully to Christ as far as he understood him, that he had two angels that would stand that he could see with his, he could see whenever he would pray. And then one day, there's an Orthodox priest coming through, administering the Eucharist, and he hears this man praying. He says, "You shouldn't pray that prayer. It's heretical." And this guy looks at the two angels and he says, "What's he talking about?" And they say, "Oh yeah, you should listen to him. That's true." And he says, "You've been standing with me all this time and you didn't correct me, you didn't tell me." He said, "Well, to correct the theology of men has been given to other men, not to angels." Now, obviously, that's the entire point of the story right there. To correct the theology of men has been given to other men, not to angels. And so, obviously, that's the punchline of the story, but it's indicative of something that you see within Orthodoxy a lot, which is the idea that the asceticism and the love of God actually is the primary thing, that it's primary a lived faith. And the ideas are secondary. Now, obviously, they take the ideas seriously, hence you have ecumenical councils and conflicts and things like that. But that would be one thing that I would identify there as a significant difference between the tradition I ended up in versus maybe what you've experienced a little bit. The other thing is, I think it is rather interesting. One of the critiques, and I don't want to go too long here because I'm already filibustering. But one of the things that you mentioned is, what do we do with all these folks who are not persuaded by it? And I think this is actually a really important question, maybe for the role of apologetics done well, not done well. Is that I think oftentimes there are people who struggle with belief. And it's not a rational thing, right? This goes to the fact that anthropology is deeper, that you're more than just a mind. And so when saying, "I don't believe in God," in some ways, and I encountered this when I was working on my documentary related to the religiously unaffiliated. And they would say that, "I don't believe in God, or I'd love to believe in God, but I need some sort of proof." And what I'd ask, what would constitute proof? There was sort of this blank stare of saying, "I don't know." But I think there was something that was telling in another aspect of the patterns that I saw amongst the religiously unaffiliated, which was that so many of them moved toward the occult and the paranormal. And when listening to their stories, and you'd say, "Well, when did your faith first start to shake?" The answer for many of them was some sort of experience, right? My parents were fighting. I prayed for them to not get a divorce. They did get a divorce. Where was God, right? And they would say it's the problem of evil, but what they're really describing is the problem of divine hiddenness. And yet, there's still this impulse to think that the world is meaningful, and there's this pursuit of something spiritual, vaguely spiritual. And I think the draw to the paranormal and the occult in that context, and this, by the way, is not just my odd sample. You could look at Clay Rutledge on this point. But I think it's because those two things are very closely related. I wanted God to show up in a palpable way, and he didn't. But if something will move a Ouija board or talk into my tape recorder, I'll take it, right? And I think that goes to the fact that in many ways, there's a notable difference between, if you see a ghost and you go, you have that terrified experience of the numinous. You don't find yourself reflexively analyzing it. You just experience it and you believe it, right? It's right there. And there's quite a significant existential difference between that and processing something analytically and saying, yes, I think that's the right conclusion. And oftentimes that process doesn't have the same sort of force, to hit a person in the chest as the experience does. And so oftentimes I think when certain people would say, I want proof, and they can't answer what it is, it's because they think of proof as, this is the chain of reasoning that gets me to, a conclusion that cannot be overturned. And then I would believe. But that's not actually true, because what they're looking for is something else. And I think that just goes to the complexity of human nature and the fact that many of our beliefs are not actually always analytically drawn. They're born on intuitions. They're born out of social, influence and a host of other things. And I think all of that is deeply relevant when asking the question, what is the good form of apologetics? What is its role? And what is not its role? So anyway, just some thoughts.
I mean, I'd love to speak to that if I can, as someone who's spent time in people's homes as a Mormon missionary trying to convince them of the gospel of the Mormon church, right? I would never dream of using what Mormon apologists put out there to try and teach anyone to join the church. What we were doing is we were trying to invoke spiritual experiences and then help people identify those spiritual experiences as something that's then sort of converting them to the church, right? That's, in a nutshell, that's what you do as a Mormon missionary. You sit with them, you know that feeling? Yeah, that's the Spirit of God. That's essentially what you're doing there. You're engendering an experience, like you said, it's experiential. And so what I find fascinating is the way the church will go, well, we know that that's how we bring people in. And in Mormonism, apologetics is almost exclusive about stopping people leaving. It's this safety net, it's this, well, before you're out, on your way out, here's some stuff you could read that might convince you otherwise. But that's not what got people in. So why is it going to stop them leaving? Because why they're leaving is probably more connected to what brought them in the first place. And that's a blind spot, I think, of apologetics, certainly in my experience.
So if I can try to draw a bunch of different threads together as we try to land the plane here. So, Jared, you raised two, important and kind of interconnected questions. What about people who don't believe, and what's apologetics for, and does it make us better? So, I think the really important thing I would emphasize is that people who don't believe don't form a natural kind. And by that I mean there's all kinds of possible reasons. It could just be, and I sort of touched on this earlier, that somebody could look me in the eye and say, I don't give a crap if you think the Gospels are reliable. I think Jesus was a insane cult leader. I think God's a moral monster, right? I think the Christian sexual ethic is repulsive. Whatever it might be. And so then it's like, all right, then we're done here. Have a good life. And you kind of like wave goodbye, and that's it. And so there's that kind of resistance, but then you talk about, okay, what about non-resistant non-believers? What about people who really do earnestly want it to be true, but it's just not, they're not feeling it? Well, it is possible that they imbibed some terrible apologetics, and then when that fell apart, they thought that was all that there was. It's like, well, here's Gary Habermas, he's like the world's foremost resurrection scholar or whatever, and it turns out that he sucks. Well, I guess that's it then. I'm sorry. And so, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. I work with a good family friend, and we have an online-ish ministry called Talk About Doubts. And people write in with their questions about Christianity, and then, just all volunteer, and we meet with them one-on-one, and they tell us, what they're struggling with, and we try to answer their questions. And a lot of people come in, and this is the problem that they have. It's like, well, I don't agree with the minimal fats. I don't think that, and we're like, it's okay. We don't either. Here, let's think about this in a better way. And so that can be an issue, but it can also be the case that even after you go, all right, well, here, we'll give you the good stuff. Here's the real, and people are still like, yeah, I'm still not persuaded. I still don't think that's, and then I think it's a whole complex range of issues. Nathan was touching on this earlier when he talked about academia. And this sort of that culture of academia of not wanting to give something up, and I think a lot of people sort of intuitively want to go where they feel like the smart people are, and so if there's a consensus, capital C, it's like, well, but the consensus scholarship says that the Gospel of John is mostly historical. It's like a blend of fact and fiction, so I'm not going to go up against that, man. Who am I? I'm just like little old me, and they get scared, It's that kind of social thing, and they really have a fear of that. And I think it does require a certain amount of toughness to just be willing to go, yeah, they're academics, but they're just wrong. And I mean, you encounter, we talk about confirmation bias. There's an awful lot of confirmation bias in, atheist academics where they will shut out papers if they think they're too conservative or they're too, apologist adjacent. And they'll use the word apologist or apologetics to intrinsically mean something bad, something question begging, right? And the word apologist, it's a slur in academic circles for that reason. And that's, something where people like my folks are trying to steal that back and recover it as a good thing. Does apologetics make us better? I think yes, in the sense that it helps people, it grounds people and it puts them in touch with reality. So, Nemo was talking about within Mormonism, it's all about experience. Just open up the Book of Mormon and wait for the lightning strike, and then you will feel the feels and the burning in the bosom. And, I'm sorry to say that a lot of, and Jared could definitely speak to this, a lot of denominations in Christianity functionally operate the same way, just wait for the Spirit to move, and then you'll know that God is real. How do I know He lives? He lives within my heart, I'm not saying, it has its place, but when that's your foundation, your epistemic foundation, I think you're really in trouble, and you're really vulnerable. And you become unable to sort of discern and figure out, okay, but what's the difference between these belief systems? How do I know one is true over another? And so I think it's a good and a healthy thing to ground people. I don't think we were made to wander around in a perpetual state of cognitive dissonance. I think we were made to be whole beings, for the heart and the mind to be united. And so I think it's good for us in that sense. It's good for our flourishing. And, just lastly, one final thought. I know I've been rambling a lot. Jared, you talked about how you struggle with this idea that Christianity is about checking a bunch of boxes about stuff. Well, I believe this, I believe that, I believe the other thing, I'm good to go. I would say, a book that had a big impact on me when I was young was C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce. And it's for those who don't know, it's people, they're dead, they're on a bus, and they get stuck in this sort of limbo place between heaven and hell, and they all have one last chance to, talk to a friend or a loved one from beyond the grave. And it's like, all right, what's going to happen? And it's all these little vignettes that play out. And it's not about, well, do you check this box or that other box? It's about, like, what are you holding on to? What's in the way of you and paradise? What's in the way, between you and paradise, between you and Jesus? And it's all kinds of different things. And so I think that would be a misconception, that, it's just about checking boxes. That's not what it's about. And a provocative last note, there are, a few names that I could think of, who I won't name, but, a couple people who are professional Christians, like apologist guys. I think they're going to hell. I'm serious, man. I think, academic sins are real sins. They're really, they're serious. And I can look at a guy like that, a professional Christian like that, who checks all the boxes, professionally checks the boxes, and say, he is farther from the kingdom than, the completely, hedonistic, secular dude that I encountered on Twitter. It's some real sense. So on that note, I will hand this back to you.
On that note, all right, we'll start to land the plane, but I want to close with a proposition that Justin Brierly actually presented to me when we were trying to figure out what the topic for his kickoff event would be. We had several different options, and Paul's won out. But his proposition was apologetics. Well, let me read it here. Apologetics won't solve the meaning crisis. What will? Do you agree with his assessment? And if not, what do you think will help with this crisis of meaning we find ourselves in?
Do I go first? Or?
Whoever would like to start.
Yeah.
All right, reverse order. All right. So we're going to take away my opportunity to think about the question, which is exactly how I like it. No, so I think to answer that question, one of the things that we haven't really done fully is define the word apologetics, right? And so I think it depends in some ways on how we set up the parameters of apologetics. I would like to, let's entertain for a minute that the term apologetics doesn't mean what it would typically mean in academia. And academia would mean this particular subdiscipline that has an axe to grind, and we are doing all we can to accumulate the necessary arguments to build our case and argue for it. And let's pretend for a moment that I am an apologist, okay? I would like to believe that the sort of thing I'm doing actually is helpful in terms of solving the meaning crisis. So what is it that I'm doing, right? As I said, in terms of what I've done throughout, reaching this point in my academic career and whatever it is that I am, it has been an attempt at just honest scholarship and honest wrestling with big questions in terms of the history of ideas. And it's one of the reasons why, if somebody comes to me and they start to ask, certain big questions, rather than taking a sort of an apologetics approach, what I do is I walk them through the history of ideas, really as someone who says, well, I've navigated this terrain, and here's what I see. Let me lay out the roadmap of what I see in terms of the history of ideas, and that may be helpful for you in terms of seeing a way forward. And in that sense, I just consider myself somebody who is, a sojourner on the question of meaning and what it is to live the good life. And in that sense, I suppose I feel a great affinity for any of the ancient philosophers who are asking those questions, what is the good life? And so in order to answer that question, they have to answer questions about anthropology and cosmology and all these sorts of things, even if the answers end up being that it's all, atoms falling through space randomly coalescing, and we're Epicureans, right? Somehow or other, right? Whatever the answers ended up being, those were the questions that they still had to wrestle with. And so, as somebody who's gone through this, this landscape that is so difficult, and I know how troubling it can be, I really sort of see myself as somebody who's just offering a guide and a sympathetic ear to somebody who I recognize is on that journey, and try to offer to them whatever I've gained through my journey in the hope that it might benefit them, and that maybe, just maybe, they can sort of find their way through it in an easier manner than I did. Give them a little bit of a shortcut. And in that sense, I see the sympathetic ear, which, if you watch the documentary Becoming Truly Human, as just as important as anything else. And so within that film, when I did that with all these religiously unaffiliated folks, it was simply a matter of asking them questions about their own journey and listening to them. None of them had any idea that I was Orthodox. They didn't know what I believed. In fact, I refused to tell them what I believed because I was interested in them, and I didn't want to poison the well in terms of the conversation. And so I suppose there's something, I dare say pastoral. I'm not a pastor. I'm no one's pastor. Thank God for that. I suppose there is something, pastoral in that way about just meeting people on that journey and walking with them through it and sharing, as I said, the sorts of things that I've encountered through just striving to do, what Jared called good scholarship. And so if that's apologetics, I think it can, right? And so I think a lot of how we answer that question probably comes down to how we define the term and the discipline. And so if we define it in a broad enough way that I become an apologist, then I would say yeah. If we define it in the way that the apologetics industrial complex might define it, well then no. So.
All right. I'm not ashamed to admit that I don't really know, to be honest with you. I don't think there's any simple or easy solution to the meaning crisis. I don't even think I can really sit here and speak to the meaning crisis in any sort of profound way. I think in some ways it is so individualistic that For me to think that I can reach inside of someone and understand why they may not feel that their life has meaning would just be a fruitless exercise. I think that a big part of the solution to whatever that crisis of meaning is individualistic in the sense of it's formed of an understanding of oneself and what appears to be missing, and then going in pursuit of that. And that's such a personal question that I don't know if any apologist or any meaning maker or any pundit or anyone like that could provide some sort of distinct, singular answer. I think as people understand what it is they need to bring meaning, they will then find voices that help them discover that, or they will find voices that help point them towards that, whatever that is. But I think in all that, maybe the one common factor is people and conversations and listening to one another. So for me, in as much as apologetics could form a good faith conversation about a certain topic, then yeah, sure, it can be helpful for a crisis of meaning. But if it's just someone trying to convince you of their point of view without them having any understanding of what it is that you're really struggling with, then I don't know how that's that helpful, I suppose.
So can you just repeat the question one more time?
Yeah, he said that apologetics won't solve the meaning crisis. What will?
Okay, apologetics won't solve the meaning crisis. What will? So this was a statement. So I think, there's a level on which I think that's true. And I tend to have I kind of have a tragic vision of the world. Thomas Sowell taught me that, the economist, cultural critic. There are no solutions. You can't solve everything. You can't save everyone. And I'm only 33, but I already understand this on a really painful personal level. It's people I love, people I'm close to, and I've had to come to terms with the fact that I can't save them. So, there's a sense in which, of course, apologetics can't save the world, because nothing and no one can save the world except Jesus. Okay, you can try to be an instrument, a vessel, and all that good stuff. But in the end, it's between the individual and Jesus. It's always been. That's kind of a downer. Sorry, but it's just it is what it is. But I have seen in my work, like with that ministry I talked about, talk about doubts. We've seen people who were like on the edge, and like staring into the abyss, and we've pulled them back, and they've been like, I can read my Bible now. Wow, this stuff is actually true. Like I'm reconnected to Jesus. This saved me. You guys saved me. And I think it is possible, but it has to be blended with relational connection. Like William Lane Craig or whoever, he might have done a debate that was kind of cool, but like he's not going to have coffee with you, right? Because he can't. It's the status thing. And so I think what Nemo touched on there is very important, and that's something I'm really proud of with our little ministry, is that we'll follow up with people. If they need to talk more, if they need to come back for 5 or 10 or 15 more follow-up conversations, we'll do that. We'll email with them. We'll listen. There's a Discord channel they can join and all that kind of stuff. And so I think apologetics is available. It is a tool. It is one means of grace, so to speak. And it can be a lifeline for people when it's blended with relationship and love. Love can save the world, or at least some of it. However much of the world wants to be saved.
I can get behind that.
Yeah. There you go.
From my vantage point, I think that even granting the broadest possible definition of apologetics, I think that it's hurting. And in addition to that, my answer would be that in light of the meaning crisis, I increasingly believe that the solution to the meaning crisis is helping other people through the meaning crisis.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Round of applause for our panelists.